Hey guys, welcome back for our Friday Wit and Wisdom lesson. I'm really excited you guys made it through your first week. You did a really good job. I'm really impressed by all of the hard work that I'm seeing, and I really want you guys to feel really good about yourselves because you've been working really hard. So let's get started. The first thing we need to do is our positive referral for today. So today's positive referral goes to Chelsea and Armando M, who were caught showing the value of grow. They both came to my office hours on Thursday for Wit and Wisdom help, and we actually worked through the whole assignment. And so they were able to get a ton of really specific help and specific feedback. And I think that really helped them feel really good. And by the end, they were done with the assignment. So if you're someone who's found our lessons hard or you need help, make sure that you're coming to office hours so that I can help you. You can find them in my office hours calendar on your Google Classroom. So make sure you add that calendar and then you can pop in Mondays and Thursdays, 10:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. And then Tuesdays and Wednesdays, I believe, are 3 to 3:30. But you can double check that on the calendar and I hope to see you there. Also, very exciting, Miss Klein Storytime is now live, so it's going to be on the K&E YouTube channel. I've also linked it for you in your daily reading section of Google Classroom. So it should be really easy to find. I've read up through chapter 5 for you guys, and I posted that yesterday so that you can follow along. If you have your book, please make sure you're reading along with me. And if you don't have your book, you can just listen. Always, you can take the AR quiz at the end of every book you're reading, and I can't wait to shout out all of the people who have done a great job with AR so far next week. So let's get started with our Wit and Wisdom lesson. We're going to start off with a book that we really are familiar with, George versus George. Your job is to listen as I read pages 34 to 35 in George versus George. I've also attached the printout or the pictures of these pages in your assignment so that if you're someone who likes to be a visual learner, you can read along with me. As I'm reading you these 2 pages about the rebel forces, I want you guys to think to yourself, what advantage did the rebel forces, and by rebel forces I mean patriots, have over the British soldiers? George versus George, pages 34 and 35. Rebel forces. George Washington took command of the Continental Army, the colony's main fighting force, on July 3, 1775, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He immediately took steps to build a professional army. It wouldn't be easy. Washington despaired over the inexperience of his volunteers, the constant desertions, so that means soldiers who just ran away, and a paralyzing lack of food and military supplies. Sometimes redcoats could shoot rebel soldiers at will because the rebels didn't have enough gunpowder to shoot back. There were 3 types of forces fighting against the British. First up, we have George Washington's Continental Army. You can see that there's many different types of soldiers. We have a Massachusetts artillery officer, Rhode Island artillery officer, general, Canadian light infantry, Maryland state troops, Green Mountain Ranger, Connecticut Light Horse Militia, New York Continental Line, Moylan's Light Dragoon, French Infantry, Maryland Infantry, and Georgia Infantry. George Washington's Colonial Army. Most men in this volunteer army were private citizens who had signed on for a year or less. The great majority brought their own weapons, food, and clothing. Some colonels bought uniforms for their regiments, but most soldiers never owned one. They wore hunting shirts instead. Compared to their opponents, the men had little training and even less pay. Though the soldiers were promised money and land for their services, the Continental Congress rarely paid on time, if at all. Sometimes there were as many soldiers who deserted each day as there were men who signed up to fight. So men were coming and going. To fill their ranks, rebel forces began accepting free blacks and later accepted slaves. By the war's end, some estimated that about 1/4 of the Continental Army was black. I want you guys to pause for a second and think and remember who got independence when our country declared independence on July 4th, 1776. And then think about who was actually fighting in the war. Does that seem fair? The Army also got a tremendous boost from foreign volunteers, including experienced, quick-witted leaders from France, Germany, and Poland. A handful of Washington's highest-ranking officers were brilliant leaders, but many were unfit for office and looted, sold army blankets, and disobeyed orders. The officers included a Boston bookseller, a breeches maker, so that's pants, a horse dealer, a hat maker, an innkeeper, a blacksmith, an English corporal who had deserted, a preacher, a butcher, a farmer, a farmhand, a tanner's hand, a swineherd, so a pig herd, and a dancing teacher. Next up, we have the Continental Navy, and there were 3 kinds of people in the Continental Navy: the lieutenant, the ordinary seaman, and a commodore. The Continental Navy. A feisty infant navy defended the coast. At its height, it had only 57 ships. The Navy couldn't hope to challenge the huge British warships, so it tried its best to damage British trade and capture or destroy enemy vessels. The Americans also had a trick up their sleeves. They were getting extra help from as many as 1,697 privately owned armed vessels. These privateers preyed upon enemy merchant ships. George Washington was part owner of at least one of them. And then the last part was the militias. We have the Rangers and Frontiersmen, the Riflemen, and the Connecticut Foot Guard. Militias. Since long before the Revolutionary War, many local areas and every colony except Pennsylvania had raised separate armed forces called militias to defend their communities from attack. Most of these soldiers had even less training than the men in the Continental Army, and their record was mixed. But militias played a crucial role in every one of Washington's victories, and they were very effective in some other important battles as well. This was partly because their style of fighting was new to their enemies, but it was mostly because they could raise enormous numbers of men on short notice and outnumber their opponents. So here we have, you can see all of the militia hiding in the forest, and then they're sneaking up on a Hessian soldier, and it says, "In the open field, the rebels do not count for much, but in the woods they are formidable." So that means they're dangerous. "They lie like bacon hunters and slip from one tree to the other." As difficult as things were for the rebel forces, they did have some strong advantages. Though George Washington drilled his army in British-style warfare, rebel soldiers had learned from fighting the Indians to travel light, hide in the woods and mountains, and use ambushes and lightning raids against an unsuspecting enemy. They could move quickly, and their earth-toned, homespun, and buckskin clothes let them melt into the countryside unseen. The British considered these tactics to be dishonorable. So I want you guys to think, what advantage did the rebel forces have over the British soldiers? You can take a minute and think to yourself. You can whisper it to your computer or tell it to someone next to you. I want you guys to hold these advantages in your mind as we move on with our lesson for today. It's going to help inform the way that things unfold in Woods Runner. So as always, we have sushi time. Our essential question for Module 4 is, why is it important to understand all sides of a story? Remember, our focusing question that we're working on is focusing question 4. What drove the Patriots to fight for their independence from Britain? And then our content framing question for today. What does a deeper exploration of elements of historical fiction reveal in chapters 7 through 9 of Woods Runner? Let's take a look back at some of the books we've already read this module. We're reading Woods Runner right now. We read The Scarlet Stocking Spy right before we left, and we read Colonial Voices Hear Them Speak. I want you to take a minute and think to yourself, what do all three of these books have in common? Take a minute and think. and whisper it to your computer or tell someone next to you. One thing that all three of these books have in common is that they're historical fiction. They're based in real events, but we know that these stories are not true, right? Unfortunately, Maddie Rose was not a real person, even though the times and events that she lived through are true. Same with Colonial Voices. Ethan is not a real person. Well, Ethan Johnson, you are a real person, but Ethan, the errand boy, is not a real person, but he did live during the Boston Tea Party, which was a real event. All of these things happened during the American Revolution. The Scarlet Stocking Spy story is related to true events that really happened in Philadelphia in 1775. Remember when we researched the Battle of Brandywine Creek? That was a real battle that was fought between the Patriots and the British. Woods Runner is based on true events that happened in Pennsylvania in 1776, just like Colonial Voices is based on events that happened in Boston, like the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Even though these characters are fictional, not real people, all of these stories can help us understand what life was like in the American colonies during these conflicts with Britain. So today, we are going to be reading chapters 7 through 9 of Woods Runner, but we're really going to be paying attention to the historical facts that Gary Paulsen weaves throughout this story. Remember, at the end of every chapter, Gary Paulsen includes a historical section that really gives us some idea of the true events and experiences that people were living through at this time. So let's get started. We're going to be starting off with Woods Runner Chapter 7. Your job is to make sure that you follow along in your PDF as I read you Chapter 7 of Woods Runner. If you are someone who has your own book or an e-reader, you can follow along in that book. When I finish reading, your job is to pause this video, go into your Friday, April 17th classwork document, and answer the 2 questions for Chapter 7. What is this chapter mostly about? And what do you wonder after finishing this chapter? 2 things I want to point out before we get started. 1, just like in class, you still have the expectation of answering incomplete sentences. Because is not the beginning of a complete sentence. And you guys need to put periods at the end of your sentences. Also, if you're explaining what is this chapter mostly about, it's probably not enough to say, his parents got kidnapped, or he's in the woods. There's a lot more going on in this book that makes it really interesting. Write it down so you can show me how much you know. I'm really excited to see. So let's get started. Make sure you have that PDF pulled up, and we're going to start with Chapter 7. Chapter 7. He had been running for 40 hours now. Just as he left Draper's Crossing, he passed a cornfield that the attackers had tried to burn. Some ears of corn had been roasted. Hunger took him like a wolf, and he grabbed a half-dozen ears, jamming them in his clothing. He ate as he walked, letting the sweet corn juice slide down his throat and into his stomach. The hunger was so intense that eating the corn made his jaws ache. The food made his body demand water. He hadn't taken time to find a well or where one was. When he came to a small creek, he stopped to drink. The water was muddy when the creek crossed the trail, so he moved off into the thick underbrush 20 yards upstream to where the creek ran clear. He knelt to put his mouth to the water, and this act saved his life. His lips had no sooner touched the water that he heard men's voices. It was a native tongue, and they were loud and laughing. There were 2 of them. Had they come upon Samuel, they surely would have taken or killed him. Samuel kept his head near the ground. Through small holes in the brush, he could see them from the waist down. They wore leather leggings and high moccasins, and each carried a musket in one hand. He could see the butts hanging down at their sides, and either a coopstick or a killing lance in the other. Both of the men had fresh scalps hanging on the shafts they carried. So that's someone's head, the scalp of their head. For the first time in his life, Samuel wanted to kill a man. The overwhelming rage that he had begun to feel while following his mother's small footprints as she had been savagely jerked along the trail was like a hot knife in his brain. If there had only been one, he would have done it, but he carried no tomahawk. All he had was a skinning knife, and his rifle fired only 1 shot. After that, the one he didn't shoot would turn on him before he could reload. With only a knife to defend himself, he'd had almost no chance. So he waited until they were out of sight. Then, staying low and moving slowly, he went back to the trail. Why had the men come back? Whatever the reason, two men alone would not backtrack too far into potentially hostile country. If there were any kind of force after them, they would want to keep moving. So, Samuel thought, maybe I'm getting close. He picked up the pace to a jog, but stayed well to the side of the trail on the edge of the thicker undergrowth, in case he ran into any others. And again, this move saved his life. Clearings left by old beaver ponds were scattered through the forest. Some were small, an acre or two. Others were 30 or 40 acres. A large clearing popped up in front of Samuel now. It was late afternoon, almost evening, and the sun slanted from the west behind him into the clearing. It was another stroke of luck. The clearing had been turned into a large encampment filled with Indians, some British soldiers in red uniforms, and, nearly quarter of a mile away, freight wagons hooked up to horses. Samuel slid into the underbrush. He crawled farther back where he couldn't be seen. Unfortunately, he couldn't see either, and he squatted in the thick foliage and tried to remember what he'd seen. 3 wagons ready to go out. 10 or 15 soldiers, including 3 officers on horses, and 10 or 15 Indians. He shook his head. No, not so many soldiers. 7 or 8, and fewer Indians, 8 or 9. One large fire in the center of the clearing, one smaller one closer to the wagons. A group of people huddled there, the captives. There hadn't been time to see them clearly, and they were too far away for him to see if his mother and father were in the group. In a rope pen near the wagons were 1 or 2 horses, 3 or 4 oxen, maybe a milk cow. There was also a spit set up over the larger fire with some kind of big animal cooking, which meant they were going to be here for some time, perhaps the night. He settled slowly back on his haunches, careful not to move the brush around him. He had caught up to them. There was a chance his mother and father were with that group of captives. He still had no plan to rescue them. Everything he'd done was just to catch up, see if they were still alive. Could they be here? He hadn't come across their bodies on the trail, and there were captives by the fire. For the moment, that was enough. The plan would come later. It would be dark soon. There was still no moon. Now he was astonished that it had only been 40 or so hours since he'd returned from the hunt. His whole life, everything in it and around it, was different now, torn and gutted and forever changed from all that it had been, and it would never be the same. It would be dark soon, and in the dark, he thought, with no moon, in the near pitch dark of starlight, there might be possibilities. He had no plan, but it would be dark soon. And just then, as he settled back to wait and think on some way to get the captives without being discovered, the whole world blew up. Warfare. The British procedure when fighting was to march at the foe in a close line. Your foe is your enemy, with 2 or 3 ranks of men. The front rank, so that's the front group, would fire at 50 or 60 yards, then drop back and reload, while the second rank now stepped forward, so the second row stepped in front of the front row, and fired, dropping back and reloading while the back row came forward in front of lines 1 and 2 and fired. This rolling volley had the effect of creating a kind of mass firepower. The weapons were very simple, but it was almost impossible to stand against the line when the men grew close, quit firing altogether, and charged, so they started running at their enemy, screaming. It took a special kind of courage to stand ready when a line of howling men ran at you with bayonets aimed at your stomach. Many times, American soldiers turned and ran rather than face what the British Army called the Wall of British Steel. So your job is to pause our lesson video, go into your classwork document, and answer your questions for Chapter 7, remembering complete sentences and punctuation. When you're done, unpause our video and we'll move on to Chapter 8. Okay, chapter 8. Same deal. We're going to listen to the chapter. Your job is to follow along in your PDF copy. When you're done, we're going to answer our questions. So keep these 2 questions in mind as we're listening. What is this chapter mostly about? And what do you wonder after reading chapter 8?
Chapter 8. The natives began whooping and dancing around the large campfire, firing their muskets in the air in celebration. Samuel crept out slowly until he could partially see what was going on. He started to move back under cover when there was a sudden increase in the racket, and the sound was different. The Indians had been firing in the air as they danced, which caused the explosion to go up and away. They were firing smoothbore muskets, weapons that made a muffled barking sound. But this new sound had the sharper, cracking quality of higher velocity rifles. Samuel crept back out to the edge and saw that the shots had come from the north side of the clearing, where another trail came in. 6 or 8 shots. Great clouds of black powder smoke came rolling out of the forest. A pause to reload, then 8 more shots. The Indians and British soldiers were stunned. A few Indians and 1 soldier went down, probably dead. Several others were wounded and hobbled into the brush for cover. But the Indians and British recovered and returned fire. Samuel was jarred and shocked by 2 important facts. First, whoever was attacking, this might end in the rescue of his parents. Second, he should help them. He moved to the clearing near the trail, raised his rifle, cocked it, and without thinking of the enormity of what he was doing, aimed at the nearest British soldier. He was less than 50 yards away. The German silver of Samuel's front sight settled on the red uniform. He set the first trigger and was moving his finger to the hair trigger when he heard a noise behind him. He wheeled, that means turned, his rifle coming around in time for him to see the 2 Indians who had nearly caught him earlier, running straight at him. What? Half a word. Then 1 Indian, the one farther away, leveled his musket and fired. Samuel felt the ball, so that's the bullet, raise his cheek. Without thinking, his rifle at his hip, he touched the hair trigger and in slow motion felt the rifle buck, saw the small hole appear in the Indian's chest. Then, through a cloud of smoke from his weapon, he watched the Indian fall as he saw the other Indian swing a tomahawk in a wide arc. He knew he couldn't raise his rifle in time to block the blow. The tomahawk was coming at his head, and he tried to duck, but the white-hot pain exploded as the side of the tomahawk smashed into his forehead, and then nothing. Wounds. Untreated battle injuries often led to gangrene, which causes the body to literally rot away, turning first green, then black from infection that travels rapidly. Because antibiotics were unavailable in the 18th century, amputation was the usual treatment. Due to the horrific odor of gangrene, it's the smell, surgeons could smell the patient and make an accurate diagnosis. If the patient was not lucky enough to benefit from amputation, so that means getting their whatever limb was infected, getting it chopped off. So if you had gangrene in your arm, they would chop off your arm. If you had gangrene in your foot, they would chop off your foot. Maggots would be introduced. So if that didn't work, maggots, those are worms, would be introduced into the wound in an attempt to aid healing. They would eat away the infection. Barring the surgical removal of body parts or the use of parasites, doing absolutely nothing and letting the patient die was the only option at the time. Be glad you didn't live back then.
Okay, guys, pause our video. You're going to go back into your document, Friday, April 17th classwork, and you're going to answer, what is this chapter mostly about, and what do you wonder? When you're done, unpause our video, and we'll move on for chapter 9. Okay, chapter 9, last chapter we're going to read today. Remember, it's the same 2 questions as before. You're listening for the answers, And when we're done reading this chapter, you're going to answer them. Make sure you're following along in your copy of the book.
Chapter 9. Strange dreams, visions of unreality, endless screams that started with low grunts and became more and more shrill until they cut his soul. Dreams of his mother, dressed all in buckskins, ladling some kind of thick stew with a wooden spoon into a wooden bowl, chewing tobacco and spitting off to the side while she held the bowl out, shaking her head. He ain't nowhere near right yet. She spit her wad of tobacco juice out again. Brain scrambled to hell and gone. Then a trapdoor came down, a lid, something thick and dark, and there was no light at all, just blessed darkness and sleep, 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 and more screams. No sense of time. Once he tried to remember his name and fought with it for a minute, or a day, or a week, or 10 years, he couldn't tell. More dreams, scattered. His mother, this time wrapped in a blanket with stringy black hair hanging down at the sides of her head while she chewed an obnoxious cud. She disgorged it, so that means she spit it back up, slapped it on his head, and tied it on with a filthy rag, spitting more tobacco juice out and nodding. Got to get the pizen out, or she's going to rot on him. It was as if his eyes never really opened, as if he saw everything through closed lids, and the images that swirled through his mind were so mixed that they became a blur. Night, day, light and darkness seemed to flop and flow over each other. Pictures would stick for a moment and then go. A horse, then a cow, then his mother leaning down, still in the dirty blanket, greasy black hair hanging down the sides of her head, raising the poultice and grinning, spitting more tobacco juice. Coming clean now, she said. Clear pus, looks clean as spring water, all the yeller gone. And then bouncing, incredibly rough bouncing, as if someone were jumping on a bed while he was trying to sleep. He would pass out in pain, rolling waves of pain. Finally, a picture stopped, just stopped in front of his eyes, in front of his mind, locked in. It was dark, or night, and he was on some kind of wooden frame lying on the ground. A fire burned nearby, and when he opened his eyes wide, the light from the fire seemed to shove a lance into the middle of his head. He grunted in pain. He closed his eyes and waited for the rolling pictures to begin again. When they didn't, he opened his eyes, but only in a slit. The image was the same, a bed frame of some kind, a fire, and this time, less pain from the light. As he watched, an arm came out of nowhere and put a piece of wood on the fire, then withdrew. He tried to move his head and see where the arm went, but the pain was so intense he nearly lost consciousness. He lay back and closed his eyes, opened them again when the pain receded. Where? Who? The words pealed in his mind like a bell, echoing around inside his head. A figure appeared next to the fire. Not his mother, but a young man with stringy black hair and a cheek full of tobacco juice. He leaned down, his face close to Samuel's. You in there righteous, or you going away again? I'm here. Who are you? John Cooper, but most just call me Coop. Where? Long story that. We be about 12 miles from where you got that egg on your head. 12 miles in distance, more than that in time. When? I don't remember. Some Indians. I think I shot at one, and then nothing. Why did I shoot at an Indian? Can't tell. We come on these Iroquois and some redcoats. We'd already seen what they took and done back at Miller's Crossing, so we snuck up proper and took them on. I remember. You were shooting. You say we. Where are the others? Asleep. I'm the night watch tonight. Plus, I've been doctoring you, and I thought you might lose your light during the night. You've been breathing like an old pump. I guess you was just sucking air hard because you didn't die. Of course, it could still happen. I had a cousin get kicked in the head by a mule. They're fractious mules. And he lived for nigh on 2 months before he lost his light. He never talked none, except now and again a kind of moan, like somebody stepping on a duck. Then he just up and died. Samuel closed his eyes, felt a spinning. Then, as if a fog were lifted, it all came back. I was tracking Ma and Pa. The redcoats, the Indians, hid our place while I was looking for Bear. They killed most everybody, but took my parents and a few others captive. Coop nodded. We saw them all around a fire, ropes tying them together. What happened to them? Coop shrugged. Wasn't much of a fight. We fired once, reloaded, laid out another round, and they ran. Them redcoats had wagons already hooked up, and they piled the captives in the wagons and lit out. We couldn't shoot no more for fear of hitting the captives. The Indians just drifted away like smoke. That would have been that, except one of them put a musket ball in Paul. It was in his gut. Awful place, that. Your gut's your stomach. We knew he was going to die. Ain't nobody comes back from a belly wound, and kept waiting for it, but he made 4 days. He gave up his light last night. No, night before. Died screaming. It was bad. Surprised it didn't bring you out of your stupor, the screaming. Kept everybody up all night. Samuel closed his eyes again, tried to put numbers together. Died 2 days ago, after making it 4 days. If a belly wound took 4 days to kill, and it happened the day of the fight, but Paul died 2 days ago, how long since they took the captives? Since the fight? 5, 6 days. You've been out 6 days. We like to not found you, and when we did, we almost left you. Thought you was with the raiders. Me? Why? Well, you wasn't with us, so we thought you was with them. But Carl did some thinking on it. Carl's my brother, and he's the one to think on things, and said, look how messed up your head was where they clubbed you, and look at the bullet hole in the Indian you killed. That's a honey of a little rifle you got, and how could you be with them and still get clubbed and shoot one of them? So we took you with us. I've been out 6 days, closer to 7, counting the night. And did you say we'd come 12 miles? Coop nodded. First 3 days? No, 4. We let you to lay. Everybody thought you would die, and there wasn't no sense dragging you. Then there was Paul with his belly wound. If we tried to move him, he would scream like a panther. Then we rigged up a drag and started to pull you back of one of them oxen they left behind when they ran. All the bumping. Coop nodded, spit tobacco juice in the fire, and listened to it hiss. We couldn't stay too long, and thought you could die just as well dragging as you could laying up somewhere. If we'd left you, something would have come along and ate you, so here we are. My head, Coop nodded. Good cut from that hawk. Carl took some deer sinew he had and an old needle he carries for fixings and sewed it right up pert. He said in case you lived wouldn't be much of a scar across your forehead. Coop smiled and with some pride added, it'd come on to having green pus, and everybody knows that's bad. So he made up a spit and backy poultice, and I tied it on with a piece of rag. Pus cleared up in 2 days. So I've been laying for 6 days? Another nod. Coming on 7. Well, how? With a start, Samuel realized he didn't have any pants on underneath the coarse blanket that covered him. How come I'm not all messed up? We took your pants off. Got them wrapped in a blanket pack with your rifle. Indian must have been in a hurry or he would have took it. Sweet little shooter like that. Also got your possibles bag and powder horn. What you feel under your rear is fresh grass. Anytime you messed, we just threw the old grass away and pulled in a half a foot of fresh new grass. Slick as a new calf, maybe slick as a baby's bottom. Maybe I should put my leggings on. Only if you ain't going out of your head again. I don't think so. Suits me. I was the one having to get new grass all the time. You ain't eaten nothing other than a little broth I got down you one time and some water now and again. Man can go a long time without food, no time at all without he has some water. I'm starving, Samuel said automatically, but with the words came the feeling, and he realized he was as hungry as he'd ever been. You ought to drink something soft first. Coop handed him a wooden bowl with a mixture of broth and meat. Go slow. This is from some salted ox they was cooking when we jumped 'em. Samuel took the bowl. He tried to drink slowly, but as the taste and smell hit him, he couldn't help gulping at it, meat and all, so fast that he gagged and threw up. Slow, Coop repeated, coming back with a blanket roll and putting it on the ground next to Samuel. You'll founder, you don't go slow. Samuel started over carefully. There was silence as he ate, chewing completely before swallowing. Small bites, small swallows. It's like fire, he thought, when you're cold. Fire moving through your body. He ate the first bowl, handed it to Coop, and watched him refill it, this time with broth and chunks of glistening fat as well as meat. The second bowl he drank and ate more slowly than the first, and while he ate, he made a mental list of questions to ask when his stomach was full. Why are you here? How many of you are there? Where are you going? Is there any way you can help me find my mother and father? Are you, will you, can you, do you? Questions roaring through his mind. He finished eating. He lay back. He opened his mouth to ask the first question, and his eyes closed at the same instant, and he was immediately asleep. And the last thing he thought as he went under was that he still hadn't put his pants on. American Spirit. Although poorly trained and weakly led and improperly fed, so badly that soldiers sometimes had to eat their shoes, the Americans took comfort from fighting on home soil and usually had much higher morale than the British. While they were often outnumbered and fought with inferior, so that means worse, equipment, this spirit had an enormous effect, and they took the phrase, morale is to fighting as 4 is to 1, to heart on the battlefield.
Okay, guys, that's the end of chapter 9. Make sure you're going into your document and answering our 2 questions. What is this chapter mostly about? And what do you wonder? When you're done, unpause our video and we're going to move on. So now that you guys have read chapters 7 through 9, we're going to move on so that we can figure out the difference between facts in fiction. We're going to be looking for those different historical facts that Gary Paulsen weaves throughout his fictional story. I'm going to show you guys how to do each part of the chart. Your job is to make sure that you're going into your classwork for today, scrolling all the way down so that you can see our facts and fiction chart and filling in the parts where I tell you to. So the first informational text that we're going to look at is the one that we read about the world. And in the world, it tells us the Native Americans who lived on the land that was called Pennsylvania fought on both sides. Your job now is to go look for an example from Woods Runner that tells you about this. When was there a time in the story that mentions the Native Americans fighting on both sides? You can go back and re-listen to the video. I've included the YouTube links for each chapter, or you can go back and reread in your PDF. When you're done, you're going to go type into your chart right here where my mouse is, examples from Woods Runner. After you found your example, your job is to figure out why is this important to Samuel's story. I've already included the sentence stem for you. Your job is to complete this sentence. This is important to the story because, pause our video, go back and complete the first row. When you're done, you're going to come back, unpause the video, and we'll do the second row together. So now that you've completed the first row about Native Americans fighting on both sides, we're going to take a look at the second row. The second informational text that we're going to be looking at was the one called Wounds. This was where Gary Paulsen tells us about the different wounds that people suffered during the Revolutionary War time. And here he tells us untreated battle wounds often led to gangrene, which causes the body to literally rot away. Oof. I want you guys to go back, look back in your document, your PDF of the Woods Runner book, or re-listen to the video, and you're going to record here an example from Woods Runner that tells you about a time about a battle wound or about gangrene, which caused the body to rot. Think really carefully about a time that happened so far in this book. After you think of your example, and remember, we're writing in complete sentences, your job is to answer why this is important to Samuel's story. This is important to the story because, and you're going to fill in your chart. So go ahead, pause our video, go back into your class document, and you're going to complete our chart. When you're done, come back, unpause the video, and we'll move on. So now we've come to the last question, and this is at the very bottom of your document, so make sure you've scrolled all the way down. How does Paulsen, remember that's the author, so how does Paulsen's use of factual information affect your understanding of this story? How does Gary Paulsen weaving in all these different historical facts help you, or maybe not help you, understand what's going on in Samuel's story? You're going to pause our video, go back into your document, and complete that final question in a complete 1 or 2 sentences. So now that you've answered the final question, that's it. You've made it to the end of our lesson. Great job. Remember, as always, by 8 p.m. today, make sure that you, 1, complete your work. So actually complete your work, turn and answer all your questions, and then click the turn in button for the Friday, April 17th classwork. Make sure you do that so you can submit it and get credit, and I'll give you feedback by Monday. Remember to practice your fluency. This will be our final day with our fluency passage that you can find in the daily reading section. And then finally, make sure you've read for 30 minutes and that you complete your daily reading and fluency log. Ms. Shrek and I go through and read all of your responses, so make sure you're finishing it and you're writing down exactly what you read. I hope you guys have a wonderful Friday and a wonderful weekend, and I will see you all on Monday.